Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. As he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests, the teachers of the law, heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, Jesus and the disciples went out of the city. This is the word of life.
Thanks be to God. Thanks, Dennis. So in the tiny print, this walk through Lent, one holy day at a time in Holy Week, is really drawn primarily from the last week. Book by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan. I also have some excerpts from another sermon that was preached to craft today's story, and just want to make sure that those things are acknowledged. So last week we began our Holy Week throughout Lent with the first day of Holy Week, which would have been Palm Sunday, right? We looked at this familiar story and its contrasting characters. Jesus, who challenged the current regime by intentionally riding into the city of Jerusalem from the east on a donkey, with a ragtag band of peasant followers who were shouting, "Hosanna." On the opposite side of the city, Roman governor Pontius Pilate marched in from the west, surrounded by Roman troops on their fancy horses with their pristine uniforms and state-of-the-art weapons, anticipating trouble on this Jewish holiday of liberation called Passover. And we also added the character of Jerusalem itself, the seat of political, economic, and religious power in Judea, its temple of Jewish faith, and in the eyes of the Jewish people, the of connection with God. And at the end of his Palm Sunday account, Mark told us Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And after he looked around at everything, because it was already late in the evening, he returned to Bethany with the 12. So did you catch that? While he was there on Palm Sunday, he took a look at the temple to see what the layout of things were, perhaps. And because it was late in the evening, they opted to return to Bethany. It's 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, and that's where they were staying for Passover, perhaps because there are an awful lot of pilgrims already in the city, and perhaps because it was cheaper, we don't know. But he was outside the city, which sets him up to then return the next morning. And as he does, Mark tells us that Jesus comes upon a fig tree. Jesus is hungry, so he goes over to see if there are any figs on the tree, knowing full well that it's too early in the season for any to be there. The tree is not yet bearing fruit. Like I said, Jesus would have known this, but instead he curses the tree before going on his way. Because, well, it would appear that it's just shaping up to be that kind of day. It is a Monday, right? Remember the fig tree, though. Mark's gospel often frames one incident inside another. As a frame for this lesson, the fig tree is more than just a tree. But for now, let's return to the story. Jesus is on his way to challenge the current authority again, Monday of Holy Week, in the temple, the place where as a boy he once sat and verbally sparred with the elders, at least according to Luke, and the place where he called his Father's house, because it was the place that had once felt more like home than anywhere else for Jesus. And with Passover drawing near, there are transactions that need to take place in the temple as Jesus enters the outer courtyard, resolutely this time, and not just for a peek. Those present are attending to the business that was involved in the necessary ritual sacrifices that were part of Passover and that festival, the sale of animals, and the work of the money changers associated with sacrificial offerings to Yahweh. In Jesus' eyes, necessary transactions gone just a little too far. So far that what Jesus saw was business overriding the true purpose of the temple, which was this. In Jesus' day, a preferred gift and meal were the most ancient forms of human connection. We meet over a meal. We do this today. The sacrifice or gift of a valuable animal or the equivalent at the temple altar would create a pleasing smell that would waft toward heaven and create a divine connection. In the sacrifice, the animal was made sacred and given to God as a gift, or returned to the offerer as a sacred meal, a divine food for a feast with God, an invitation, if you will, from God to the offerer to share a meal, a powerful connection, right? And it's important to note that the offerers in the day never thought that the point of the sacrifice was suffering, or that the animal was a substitution dying in their place as a punishment for their sins. For them, this ritual was a normal part of divine worship in Jesus' day to allow them a connection with God. And as a Jewish rabbi, Jesus would have known this. In the context of the day, he would also have known that the money changers and the dove sellers were legitimate. Pilgrims were arriving in Jerusalem for Passover from all over the known world, and they were bringing Roman money because that's what they used in the city. But you could not pay your temple tax with Roman money because, wait for it, it had Caesar's picture on it. Because they considered this image idolatry, the high priest then ordered that the money that was paid in taxes to the temple be converted to the Jewish shekel in order to be acceptable for temple business. Enter the money changers, who profited mightily in those exchanges, by the way, as did the priests. And, if you think about it, traveling from all over the known world, since very few were likely to travel to Jerusalem from Asia Minor dragging an unblemished goat or carrying a cage full of pigeons for their temple sacrifice, there was even more profit to be had. It wasn't just about a money exchange. They would come so they didn't have lug animals with them to acquire their sacrificial animals once they were there. Enter the merchants, legitimately, to a point. And then there's other complications like this one. The bigger picture of the temple was this and how it was run. War and its conquests had shifted the previous priesthood hereditary lineage to an elevated status won by war. So what we're used to seeing in the Old Testament went by the wayside, and there were basically 4 families who jockeyed for a position as high priests in the temple, and it was a status that wasn't something that came naturally to them, meaning that at this point in history, the chief priests and elders had become little more than Roman puppets clamoring for power and selling out their people in the name of God. In Jesus' eyes, the cumulative effect of all of these elements now overwhelmed the temple courtyard. Commerce was necessary to sustain the worship of God in his temple. Yes. Animals had to be sold for sacrifice. Roman money had to be changed into Jewish money to pay the temple tax. Yes. But not in the temple precinct. There were other places those transactions could take place. So it was a time for clearing out, a return to the integrity of the purpose for which the temple was created, to serve as a meeting place between God and God's people. A place for people to come and pray and find a connection to God. This is the meat, no pun intended, of Jesus' challenge to the current authority. Again, today, on Monday of Holy Week, in the temple, the place that had once felt more like home to him than anywhere else. So imagine walking in with him and seeing the temple courtyard as Jesus saw it. The sounds, the smells, the rattle of coins on the tables, the reek and cries of animals of all shapes and sizes. And then imagine the change that comes over him. He has come to this holy place at Passover to pray, expecting reverence and worship and prayer, and instead all his business, from the poorest of the poor to the high priests present that day. So suddenly this healer, this loving, forgiving Jesus that they and we think we know, rolls up his sleeves and erupts in a whirlwind of anger as he heads up to an unsuspecting guy, bless him, at the currency exchange booth, and in one swift motion knocks the table on its side and coins fly everywhere. And before the stunned crowd of people who were there can possibly react, he does the same thing to the next table and the next and the next. Now people are scrambling to get out of his way as he throws the chairs of the pigeon sellers to one side and yells at people gathering up their wares to move out of his way, and then stands in the middle of the temple courtyard, eyes flashing fire, as he quotes Isaiah and Jeremiah and bellows, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Why are you here, if only for your own gain? This is my Father's house." And the chief priests and the teachers of the law hear this and begin looking for a way to kill him, for they are afraid. Even more so because, at least at this moment in the week, the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. As things settled down, when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went back out of the city. And the fig tree? When Jesus and the disciples head back into Jerusalem from Bethany the next day, the fig tree that Jesus cursed has withered. It would seem that whether temple or fig tree, sometimes things need to be knocked down to make